Hello, thank you for joining me today. We're going to be making one of my favorite types of cards for the holiday season, which is a card that you can pretty much give to anybody you want. So we're going to start with some navy blue cardstock and the largest stamp from the Snowflake season stamp set from Simon Says Stamp. And since I do plan on embossing this image and it is fairly detailed, I am using my Misty stamp positioning tool to help make sure that I get as clear of an impression as possible. And as usual, before I actually stamp my image, I'm going to use my anti-static powder bag to make sure that I don't get any wayward bits of embossing powder sticking to where I don't want it to. And then once we have a good impression, I'm going to go ahead and emboss this image with a silver glitter embossing powder from Hero Arts. And this is probably one of my favorite embossing powders to use, especially on navy cardstocks and other dark blue colors, because it just reflects so nicely. And here I'm just using a dry paintbrush to kind of brush off some of the embossing powder that didn't want to stay where I wanted it to. And I did have my heat gun warming off to the side so it would be plenty hot before I brought it to the paper. And I do generally kind of run the heat gun along the back side of the paper before I go to the front to heat the embossing powder, just because it helps a little bit with warping. And once we have all that embossing powder nice and melted, we're going to put the panel back into the Misty, and we're going to use that same image to stamp on the other side of the panel. We're just going to stamp it a little bit off center. And often with cards like this, I will avoid things being symmetrical on purpose, simply because then that means later on I don't have to worry about keeping things symmetrical, and I can kind of just put things where I want them, as opposed to if I was keeping everything nicely lined up and even, I would kind of feel like I would have to continue to do that, and sometimes I'm just lazy. And then for this second image, I originally decided that I was just going to use Perfect Pearls in the color Heirloom Gold for this image over the embossing ink, since the embossing ink will grab and hold on to that perfect pearl. But I was going for something more subtle, and I think that instead of subtle, it came off more unimpactful, so I did end up changing my mind and slightly modifying this later. So here I'm still really enjoying how the perfect pearl is looking. I think once I buffed away the excess perfect pearl, that maybe I pressed a little bit too hard, and then with the addition of all the other stamping around the panel, that I felt like that second large image really started to get lost. And then once I've buffed away a lot of the excess perfect pearl, as well as some of the anti-static powder that was still on the panel, I'm going to use some of the smaller snowflake stamps that are from the same Snowflake season stamp set. And to borrow a phrase from Kathy Zilski, we'll just do some free range stamping. And we're going to start off with Champagne ink from Delicata, and then we're going to move on to the Golden Glitz Delicata ink. And I probably really should have re-inked this ink pad before I started, but it made for some nice background snowflake images, I think. And then to punch up the effects of our free range stamping, we're going to take about a 1-to-1 mix of clear embossing powder and holographic embossing powder, and we're just going to go over some of those snowflakes. And just going over them with this mix both adds a little bit more sparkle to the snowflakes, as well as deepening the color of them as well. And since I did use pigment inks, which take a little bit longer to dry than their typical dye ink, they will grab onto the embossing powder, just not quite as well as an embossing ink. And while I'm embossing the various images, I do try to keep my heat gun moving so that it's not aiming at one particular spot on the paper for too long, so I don't scorch the paper or start to warp it. And right about here is where I decide that that second large image is kind of just underperforming for me. So then I use the Golden Glitter embossing powder from Hero Arts. And since the embossing ink under that Perfect Pearls was still kind of damp, it was able to grab onto just enough of the embossing powder to add some shine to it. And then we're going to use some more of the small snowflake stamps from the same Snowflake season stamp set. And we're going to start off with the white unicorn ink from Hero Arts. And then there's a few even smaller snowflake stamps in this same set. There's quite a bit of snowflake images in this set, but here we're using a platinum dewdrop ink from Memento Brilliance, and then we're going to be using the copper dewdrop ink from that same line as well to just fill in some background space. Then while we put that panel off to the side just to let all that pigment ink dry a little, we're going to die cut our Happy Everything sentiment, which is using a die from Kathy Zilski and Simon Says Stamp. And we are going to die cut the background layer from some regular vellum and the actual sentiment layer from a textured silver cardstock. And I am using craft tweezers to kind of help me with placement, as well as using art glitter glue with the precision tip just to kind of help get just the right amount of glue on the back of the word without there being too much spillage over onto the vellum. And then after looking around to find the tittle for the eye, we're ready to place our sentiment onto the card. And once we're happy with that placement, we're just going to put a little bit of dimension on the back of the panel, and we're just going to use some fun foam. It's easy, it's cheap, it's everywhere. And then we're just going to put a little bit of that art glitter glue on the back, which also gives us a little bit of moving around time when placing it down on the backing panel, just so we can try to get our margins as even and straight as possible. And then I'm just going to use a clear acrylic stamping block just to push everything down to make sure it's secure. And then once it's added to a card base, we are done. And this is our card. And if you've lasted this long, thank you so much. And I will leave you with a few images of the completed card.